So in this chapter, we are going to explore the Web Storage API. Now there are in fact two pieces to this. There is local storage and session storage. They're pretty much the same, although they have a very subtle difference. Now before we get into the details, what is this storage idea? Now if you want to jump into your Chrome DevTools or your developer tools of any kind, inside the Chrome DevTools we have this application. You'll see this storage panel here, and you can see that we have some information about the amount of storage that we've used, and you may have already spotted this session storage and this local storage. We can then click on these, and you can see that they expect some kind of key and a value. Similarly, our local storage expects a key and a value as well. Now you can see here that we already have some information. Now, because we are using Webpack in this course, Webpack has actually set some information inside of our local storage that it wants to use some kind of silent option for our logging. And if we jump into our Webpack configuration, scroll down to the bottom, you can see that we have this client log level of none. So this keeps things nice and silent. Now, before we dive into what this is actually doing here, I wanted to just show you how you can visualize and see what is in our local and session storage. But that doesn't really help us understand what it's for. Now, traditionally in a web browser and a web application, we would have information stored in cookies. Now, this would have to be passed back to the server upon the requests that we want to make, whereas a local storage allows us to save data on a specific domain in a particular way, so we can add functionality to our sites. For instance, we might want to add some kind of offline capability. Imagine perhaps you are on a train or an aeroplane and you want to create a document offline. What we could then do is write the data to the local storage, and when we gain access to a connection, we could then grab the data from local storage and then post it off to a server. So it has many use cases, and this is a good example of one of them. We also have a very common use case, which, as Webpack is demonstrating here, we can use it simply to remember our choices. So in this chapter, we're in fact going to build a small UI component, which is going to say, would you like to accept cookies? Now, I'm sure that you've been on many websites that say, would you like to accept or decline the cookies? If you hit decline, we're then going to save the fact that you've declined it in our session storage. So when you come back to the website, we're then going to ask you again. Otherwise, if you click yes, that you accept the cookies, and we're going to put it in local storage because local storage, unlike a cookie, has no expiry date. So until you go ahead and perhaps press clear all or remove this selected, here we can go ahead and delete it. Now, if I press refresh, because Webpack is adding this for us, it's going to come right back. So I can clear it and refresh as much as I want, but Webpack is adding it every single time. However, our application is going to behave slightly different. Now, what we're going to do is jump into our console and have a look at these storage objects. I think we've covered what local storage gives us, and throughout this chapter, it's going to become more apparent when we start setting and getting data, dealing with JavaScript data structures. We're also going to write a nice utility function to wrap local storage to make things a lot easier. We're going to look at error handling, on-change events, and so forth. Now, the purpose of this video is to introduce you to the concept of local and session storage. It's much easier to demonstrate the functionality of the two when we actually start writing some code. But conceptually, we should understand that it's essentially like a JavaScript object. We can have a key and a value. Now, the value has to be a string. It can't be a function or a number or an array or an object, which might leave you scratching your head thinking, well, this doesn't sound very useful. However, of course, we can use tools at our disposal, such as JSON.stringify, a method to convert a JavaScript object into a string, and we're going to then learn how to take it back from the browser and parse it back to a JavaScript object. So not only will we examine some simple use cases, you'll understand how to create more complex data structures and learn how to set and get any data that you like in our local or session storage. Now, both of our local or session storage, if we jump into our index, both of them exist on the window object. If we go ahead and press window.storage, we can see that we have local storage, and you can see that we have session storage. So first off, what we'll do is log out our local storage. So I'm going to wrap this in a quick console log. I'll duplicate it, and then we'll change this across to session storage. So when I save this out, we can see this in our developer tools. And you can see that we have these storage and storage objects. So both of them, to my eyes, look exactly the same, although this storage object has one item in it. It's got a length of 1, and we can see that log level of Webpack with a string value of silent. So we understand that our storage at this point is simply an object that's persisted in the browser. Now, the interesting thing about local storage is that it will persist essentially forever. Until we wipe our storage, it's going to be there. Now, session storage is a little bit different. So when we go ahead and close the browser tab, that session has now been destroyed. So that's pretty much the difference between the two. And I wanted to explicitly log these out side by side so you can see this storage word. Now, the reason I've logged out this storage word is if you look at the prototype on our object, you can see that we have this storage constructor. So what we can in fact do is say window.localStorage.constructor equals storage. We'll hit save and we can see true and true. So they are in fact based off of the same prototype. So the browser implementation for local and session storage is essentially identical. But the only difference is our local storage, things that we add in there, will be persisted essentially forever. Session storage has the exact same API because the constructor is the same. However, as soon as we close the browser tab, it's going to be destroyed. So that's the fundamental difference between the two. And I wanted to just guide you through this and talk about local storage in a bit more detail so that you're very familiar with how this works. And I think by investigating these storage objects, we can then look at our APIs a lot more in depth before we start to dive ahead and examine them in more detail. Now, with modern browsers such as Google Chrome, Firefox, and so forth, we have full access to this storage API. However, older versions of Internet Explorer do not support it, and I'm talking very old versions such as IE6, IE7. Now, IE8 does in fact support local storage, which essentially is a completely dead browser which has a very, very low market share, which means that local storage is pretty much going to be available for us to use anywhere we like. However, it does mean that we should be a bit more sensible. A good developer will then detect a feature before using it, otherwise we might create some kind of errors. So this is just something that I like to do. Now, it might be that we want to feature detect our local storage like this. There is another option that we can say, because we can look at the type of keyword and say storage. So this is going to give us the return value of a function if we have a look down here, because our local and session storage objects are essentially calling new storage underneath, which is a constructor. If we hover over here, you can see that we have this new keyword inferred to us. So storage is a constructor. Under the scenes, the JavaScript engine is booting up a new storage object for us against our local and session storage. So we can in fact say if the type of storage equals function. We can then save this out and we have true, true, and true. There are, of course, so many ways that we can feature detect in JavaScript. I really like this one because we are checking that our window.localStorage constructor is in fact equal to the storage object. So we know that we have full browser support here. It might be that we also want to make this a bit more explicit, and we can say window.localStorage, and we can say and window.localStorage. So what this will do is check if our storage constructor exists and our window.localStorage is also available. Now at this point, it might be that we decide to drop the window prefix. We don't actually need to use the window dot. These are functions available on the global scope. However, I kind of like to use this approach when referencing global objects, as it makes things a bit more clear. So now if we save this out, we have 4 different options. We could, of course, convert this across to a Boolean if we wanted to, by doing something like this, wrapping the expression in some brackets and then parsing it across to a Boolean using some type coercion. This is called the double bang syntax or the double exclamation, whatever you want to call it. But essentially it's parsing this expression across to a true or false explicit value. If we were to, for example, just take this and add it inside an if statement, so we could say if the type of storage, it's essentially going to do the same thing. It will execute because this is a truthy value in our case. However, if you want a proper true or false value, then we can coerce it across to an explicit Boolean. So we've talked through what local storage is. We've talked through this storage object and how the API is basically the same for both local and session, We've talked about the behavioral differences between the two and the fact that local storage is persistent essentially forever. Session storage will get destroyed as soon as we close the browser tab. There's a couple of ways, and we've talked through how to dive into our JavaScript APIs a little bit further. And there's a few ways that we've covered that we can feature detect these APIs before we go ahead and use them. Now, this is a widely supported API. There are other APIs in this course, which we of course want to feature detect to make sure they are fully available before we go ahead, start using them, and perhaps crash our program if we're too far on the cutting edge for particular browsers. So that's it for this video. This is a quick introduction to the web storage API. And throughout this chapter, we're going to be building out a nice web utility for interacting with our storage APIs in a bit of a cleaner way whilst deeply understanding it. So that's it. Let's jump into the next lesson.